This has been our usual marathon, and people may feel tired, but we have a very interesting presentation and hopefully debate after it. So we have two lectures, one short lectures. One by Christian Welzel, the other by Peter Schmidt. Each person will have 30 minutes for presentation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. So without further ado, let's start. I may be blocking the screen a little bit, but I can't move because there's no remote control. And I will serve the function of the remote control. Okay, Chris.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, thanks for coming to my presentation. I hope Boris is also here. Where is he? Oh, he's hiding.
Oh, he's
we are recording.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming anyways. I hope you will enjoy it. I just got today morning when I opened my inbox, I had the message from the editorial office of the journal that I got the final approval for the article that is the background of that presentation. Did you click? Thanks. So the background is a paper published by Alleman and Woods in Comparative Political Comparative Political Studies, titled Value Orientations from the World Value Survey, How Comparable Are They Cross-Nationally? And they make a claim that the major concepts that have been used in the World Value Survey, such as traditional versus secular rational values, such as survival versus self-expression values, and the updates of these concepts called secular values and emancipated values are invalid. And why? They claim they are invalid for two reasons. First, the items that are behind these constructs, or each of these constructs is a multi-item construct. The items that create these constructs are not merging on a single dimension. And second, there is a lot of variability in the dimensionality from one nation to the next. And the conclusion is then they are incomparable across countries, and then the concepts are invalid. One more. And that has, of course, far-reaching consequences, because if they are right, that means that the last 30 years of research that has been based on these constructs, you can trash it. So you can imagine this was something we took on as a challenge, and we knew ourselves that these claims are correct. The conclusion, of course, is not, but we knew the claims are correct, that there is no unidimensionality at the individual level within countries, and there is variability in the dimensionality across countries. We knew that. Actually, we pointed that out several times before, and we also anticipated that such a thing would come, especially in front of the booming industry of multigroup confirmatory factor analysis. People learned M+, and what they're doing right now, almost with obsession, is seeing if dimensional structures are similar across countries, and if they are not, we found incomparability. And we trash the concepts. Yeah, this is what we basically criticize, because it's also reflecting more and more the consensus on the methodologists what defines equivalence or comparability. So actually, you can break it down into three conditions. First, items have to converge in a single dimension. So they have to be.
No, forward. The other way around.
Sorry.
That's it. So items have to converge in a single dimension. And usually you get the lowest level of disaggregation, normally the individual level of analysis. That's the first. The second is that the individual level patterns of inner item convergence have to be as invariant as possible across different aggregate level units, usually countries. And a third requirement is that aggregate level patterns replicate those that we find at the individual level. One more. If you think about that, there are two fundamental assumptions or premises that inform these three requirements. First, measurement validity hinges solely on a construct's inter-item convergence. Yeah, this is what it is about. Items should be as interchangeable as possible. Sometimes you read even sentences that if the components of a construct do not converge in a single dimension, the thing is somehow not real. If the components are not interchangeable, the thing is not real. Kind of, this is arguing as if hydrogen and oxygen make water unreal because they are not exchangeable. Right? That's the logic. Feels real to me though. Second premise is that convergence patterns at the individual level have priority. You could say ontological priority over those you find at the aggregate level. And that's very obvious from the strategies these scholars apply, because you would see, if you look into the Alleman Woods paper, and if you remember what Boris has done yesterday in a very technically formidable way, they just look at the individual level coherence patterns. There's no view on the aggregate level, whether there is convergence among the components at the country level. It's just not looked at. It's of minor relevance. We argue that both of these premises are fundamentally flawed. And we think we have two straightforward reasons for that. First, convergence patterns, and this can be easily shown, convergence patterns at the aggregate level exist in their very own right. They have no ontological dependence on whatever patterns exist at the individual level. There is a wall of non-inference between these two levels of analysis. They simply don't talk to each other. Second, the first and foremost indicator of a construct's reality anchorage is its external linkages to other phenomena, and not its internal convergence. So this is our second point we want to make. The evidence I'm trying to provide for this is on the basis of emancipated values. And one can show with this construct quite clearly, and Boris has done this already yesterday, so I don't have to do that job, thank you. Showing that constructs show highly variable internal convergence. I'm concentrating on the latter part, but nevertheless exhibit powerful and important linkages to other phenomena. That's actually quite a very interesting thing, but many people are not so aware of that possible coexistence. Our conclusion from this is, this you will also see in the paper that I've sent around, that it's time for a paradigm shift. Instead of being obsessed on and on with internal convergence, we should shift the criterion of priority, not as the only criterion, but the criterion of priority in judging measurement validity from internal convergence towards external linkages. In some sense, this would also be helpful to get science back to what it is about, and that's explanation, right? We want to get things that have predictive power, because if we have predictive power, we have manipulative power, and then we can change things so that undesirable things are not happening and desirable things are coming about, which in the end I think is the ultimate purpose of doing science. I have 6 steps of reasoning through which I will try to navigate you. I will say something about Max Case's famous MicroMacro Puzzle, talking second about ecological effects, which are very powerful and which shape societies in very important ways, and which are simply not visible at the individual level because they are ecological. Which should us lead away a little bit from the focus on the individual level patterns. Third, I will argue that many applications of multigroup confirmatory factor analysis are a gigantic exercise in the individualistic fallacy. Fourth, I will shortly delve into the distinction between dimensional logic and combinatory logic of construct formation, and why I think that the first one has advantages over the latter. Fifth, I will talk to the concept of compository substitutability. And in the last step, I will have a short empirical illustration. The MicroMacro Puzzle. It goes back to Philip Converse's discovery in 1964, American voter and stuff like this, of non-attitudes. So Converse was surprised when he analyzed individual level survey data from the US, public opinion surveys in the context of elections, that people's attitudes were incredibly unstructured. He was thinking that left and right, or conservatism versus libertarianism, there should be a lot of latent dimension that structures people's attitude. But the correlation patterns were so weak and incoherent and inconsistent that he started to talk about non-attitudes. Later on, it has been discovered by scholars like Page and Shapiro, Stimson and McCune, that this is actually quite normal in individual level mass survey data. You have a lot of random noise. There's a lot of random measurement error, and usually correlation patterns and dimensional patterns are kind of murky. At the same time, however, as soon as you start to aggregate attitudes, orientations to country level measures, averages, medians, whatever, and then you look at coherence patterns and linkage patterns, they become all of a sudden very clear and very strong and very meaningful. And that's kind of what was called the MicroMacro Puzzle. One conclusion from that should be, we should not be so nervous if we don't find at the individual level within country always the same correlation patterns. Because weak patterns of correlation and variance in them is quite the norm. And second, it has no relevance whatsoever for the convergence patterns that we nevertheless find at the aggregate level. So this is what I call the wall of non-inference. You cannot just infer from patterns at one level to those at the other. One example is ecological effects, and that I give you one instance for that. You will find it, for instance, when you look at emancipative values and protest behavior. There is an individual level correlation. It is of a modest strength. It's a 0.25 correlation. It's positive. It's significant in almost all countries. And it tells you that people who are more emancipatory in their orientations tend to protest more than others, right? However, there's a much more powerful link between these two variables, and that comes from an ecological effect. Because if you look at what determines a person's protest participation more, is it whether the person herself is more emancipatory, or is it whether the person lives in a country where the average level of emancipation is very high? It's the latter. And that is something you simply cannot see at the individual level. Yes. And that relates to something that's really funny. Aleman and Woods also cite this to kind of invalidate analysis that happens at the aggregate level. There's a famous, and this quote has been in many methods books in political science. It's from Przeworski and Tuney, The Logic of Social Inquiry, published in the early 70s. Quote, an ecological correlation, so at the country level, yeah, between two attitudes or between emancipative values and protest behavior. An ecological correlation is spurious if it is not reflected in the same way at the individual level within each aggregate unit. I think this is phrasing the premise of multi-group confirmatory factor analysis very well. What is this telling us? Ron and I actually in 205 in our book, we discussed an interesting example. Think of the relationship between mass unemployment and the Nazi vote in the late 20s, early 30s in Germany. We have a very clear cross-regional correlation. Regions or constituencies that had higher rates of mass unemployment had a higher vote share for the Nazis. Yeah? However, at the individual level, you would not find a significant correlation between unemployment status and voting for the Nazis. People who were unemployed were not more likely in a given constituency to vote for the Nazis than people who were employed. According to Przeworski and Tuney, that aggregate correlation across the regions is spurious. the conclusion is the Nazi rise to power had nothing to do with mass unemployment. This shows you how absurd that logic is. Yeah? And what you can, actually that logic is in itself, and that's the irony about it, it's in itself a flagrant illustration of a fallacious inference, only in the opposite direction of inferring, namely from the individual to the aggregate level, because you say, because that correlation doesn't exist at the individual level, the one that I find at the aggregate level is not real, when in fact it was really real. Simply what happened, it was an ecological effect. When you lived in an environment where many people were unemployed, everyone got scared. And then it didn't matter if you yourself were a carrier of that characteristic. And all the people were more likely to vote for this party. Yeah. So this is again illustrating that you just cannot make inferences. Unfortunately, yes? When you look what multi-group confirmatory factor analysis is doing, it's doing exactly that, because people tell us country level means are not comparable if they do not reflect the same pattern of inter-item coherence at the individual level. Again, a conclusion from the individual to the aggregate level that is fallacious. Now, Boris talked about this yesterday already. We know this as the distinction between reflective scales and formative indexes. Boris depicted it as it is usually depicted in the methods literature, that the causal error goes in a different direction. In formative indexes, it goes from the components to the overall construct. In reflective logic, the overall construct is there already before, and the components are manifestations of it. I don't think that's the basic difference. I think the basic difference lies somewhere else. The basic difference lies how these concepts go about non-overlapping variants between components. In reflective logic, which I call dimensional because it always looks after dimensional patterns. In reflective logic, non-overlapping variance between components is simply measurement error. And that's the reason why you weigh down by factor loadings components that do not share as much variance with the latent construct as the others. Yeah? Inter-item exchangeability is what you want to maximize, and then any part of the variance that's not overlapping is measurement error. In combinatory logic, you have a completely different approach. Here, non-overlapping variance is not measurement error, it's complementary reality coverage. Getting distinct things together, because only when you combine two distinct things can the overall thing be different from its components. You think in terms of combinations that can be consequential. For that you have, of course, to have a theory. So that approach is also not so data-driven, it's more theory-driven. So think of the Human Development Index. It combines life expectancy, per capita income, and education, not because these components are interchangeable representations of each other. No, it combines them because they have distinct coverages of reality, and only for this reason can the Human Development Index that is produced on this basis be different from each of its components. So in combinatory logic, you require non-overlapping variance among the components rather than condemning it. It's a totally different approach. Now, combinatory logic has no precise requirements how different, how distinct the components have to be. Yeah? But they have to be somehow and significantly distinct. Now, here's the thing. Emancipative values. We aggregate them from 12 items. You can get the scale is from 0 to 1.0. So you can get a score over the 12 items of 0.4 or 0.5. Yeah? Now that same score for two persons or for two countries can come from very different combinations of partial scores, right? In one country, the 0.5 can come from so-and-so margin autonomy, from so-and-so margin choice. In another country, can be different. Compository substitutability says that doesn't matter. What matters is the overall performance. So you have to have a theory that says that the overall performance over a defined field is what matters, no matter how exact the internal composition is that gets us to this overall performance. Most of you are teachers. Most of you have graded exams. In the end, you give a grade point average. Do you care about how exact the composition of partial task performance was? You give an overall performance thing. And that has consequences on whether the student passes on and what, in the end, the overall grade point average will be looking like. So it's really real, even though the components might reflect different compositions in different areas. So here the question would be, if a country has a 0.4 on emancipative values, but in one country it's the autonomy component that is the strongest component, and another country has also 0.4, and it's the choice component that is, would that make a difference? Well, we can test this. We can look whether differences in country means vary in their consequences, for instance on democracy, depending on whether the coherence of the components is variable. One more. And one more. That's no one back. No, that's okay. Here I plot I use the Cronbach's alpha to look whether emancipative values have different coherence strength in different countries. And you have a higher Cronbach's alpha, so the more you go to the right, the more strongly are the components of emancipative values in that country convergent. Yeah? The more you are to the left, the less they are convergent. And here I have plotted the mean levels in emancipative values, and you see, Boris is indeed also right, there is a lot of variability. The same mean can represent very different coherence strengths. Yeah? And there's quite a bit of variation, especially in the middle part, which should be natural. When you go to the high levels of emancipative values, it must be convergent, because you cannot get high overall scores in emancipative values if not all components are high, right? And if you're very low, you can only get very low scores if all components are low. So you have convergence down and up, and in the middle it's murky. And there's variability. However, how much? Well, then we can say, yes, there is the problem of coherence in equivalence, but we can also say it's a problem of degree. It's not a categorical problem, and it's, quantitatively speaking, a minor problem, because the divergent variation between mean and coherence is exactly 37%, which you get is the opposite number of the 63, because 63% of the variation in means and coherence strength is convergent, which tells us, for most of the part, higher mean means also stronger coherence. Now here's one of my hobby horses, an index I have created with Amy Alexander, effective democracy that combines democratic freedoms and law enforcement. And we combine that, well, is another example for a two-dimensional, it's not a one-dimensional construct. Law enforcement and democratic freedoms do not map on each other in a perfect manner. They are independent, they are almost orthogonal. And this is the reason why we combine them, because we think democracy is in place when we have democratic freedoms, but they need to be enforced through rule of law. There's many examples where this doesn't happen. Singapore has no democratic freedoms, or very limited ones, but is pretty good in law enforcement. Doesn't make it democratic. If you multiply the two components, you will get exactly that result. And so on and so forth. And here we see emancipative values mapped quite nicely on effective democracy, which also tell us these values are comparable, because they map on a third standard of reference, a tertium comparationis, which usually is the definition of comparability. And they map on it by 71%. Now, I asked for me the question, what happens if I add to the country mean and emancipative value. So here is the first model. This is practically the graph that we have seen. I got 68% explained variance in effective democracy by the variation in the means that the countries have in emancipative values. Now the question is the variation in the coherence strength that I find in the individual level, at the individual level within countries, is this a term of disturbance that turns insignificant the impact of the mean or washes it away or something like that? And we clearly see the coherence does something. So that means stronger coherence in these values is also having an additional positive effect on effective democracy. It does matter. So emancipative values on a stronger coherence strength are more powerful than the same mean and emancipative values at a lesser coherence strength. Still, this effect remains the strongest, and by far so. And it does not become in any way less significant. So variability in internal convergence cannot be completely ignored. I give you that. But as far as it turns out, it is a relatively minor disturbance when we look at external linkages. I did another one. Here are the components of effective democracy, which is democratic rights index, rule of law index, and effective democracy itself. 3 different regressions. And I plugged in emancipative values and then a variation. Sometimes a different component is the strongest in a country. And I looked whether this variation in component composition in the same score of emancipative values has any impact in the regression, and it doesn't, according to this here. So that tells us that this coherence convergence is really not such a big problem. And then moving along what Boris did yesterday in his latter part, where he moves precisely in the right direction, looking at how is the structure of these external linkages and decomposing emancipative values for their 4 components and see, does the overall index usually catch what the strongest single component has? And this is pretty much what we get from these analyses. So this bar is the correlation of the overall index. This is the choice component, this is the equality component, and so on. And you see, this bar is usually either the longest or the second longest. Which component has the lead varies with the different dependent variables. Yeah? Sometimes it's the equality component that has the lead. Sometimes, most of the time, it's the choice component that has the lead, but it varies. When I have, however, the overall index of emancipative values, I capture much of this variation in one variable. And this is on the individual level, where that result is even clearer, that the overall index trumps in its explanatory power each of its components. One more. I skip over this and then the last, one more. Yeah, that's good. So any similarities with people in the room in terms of names are totally accidental. I just want to illustrate some of the absurdity that happens in this business of multigroup confirmatory factor analysis. We assume we have 2 variables scaled from 0 to 1. One is trust, one is tolerance. You see the scales here. We have a global mean exactly at the midpoint of the scale at 0.5. We have a country, B land, that has a mean of 0.2. And we have a country, A land, that has a mean of 0.8. Now we have a person in A land that scores here on trust and here in tolerance. Her name is Rangin. So if we have many of these people in A land, yeah, sometimes this is higher and that is lower. If we have many of these people, what will we get in a multigroup confirmatory factor analysis? A negative correlation between trust and tolerance in country A. Then we have Boris in country B, and he scores higher here and he scores higher here. If we have many people of this who are consistent above the country mean or consistently below the country mean, we will have a positive correlation in B land for trust and tolerance. And this is the tricky business that multigroup confirmatory factor analysis does. It changes the reference standard. It manipulates, it does not measure everyone against the same reference standard, which would be the global mean. And what it also does, because we always look at within country stuff, we reduce, we eliminate large-scale variation and reduce it to pockets of small-scale variation and base our judgment on what we find there. If we would measure Boris and Rankine against the global mean, we would get a huge positive correlation between trust and tolerance, and that would be the right thing to do because it takes into account that where you are on the scale is important. When you always set the country mean at 0, you eliminate the differences between the country means, and that's automatically done in every analysis that does multigroup confirmatory. I'm ready. And we can be safe because we saved emancipative values and how real they are. I just heard that this wonderful design was made in R, and I have heard it reflects country level profiles of emancipative values, and I think that looks pretty real. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. There are no discussions yet. I'm sure there will be some reactions. So Boris.
Yes, thank you, Chris, very much. Very fascinating. And today you clarified further some points which were not so clear for me even yesterday. But your presentation also raised some considerations in my head that I also have not been aware of yesterday. So I have two principal comments. I see the 3 key points in your defense, and I think I agree with each single point, but I think that combining together, they are not very consistent and even slightly contradicting to each other. First, actually, multi-group confirmatory factor analysis does not say nothing about correlations between your measure, your construct, and some other variables. It allows us to make some conclusions only about inter-construct correlations. So the argument about the differences between aggregate level analysis and individual level analysis is fully correct, but you mentioned the example about NATS and unemployment. You measure unemployment, when you measure unemployment at the aggregate level, it's really not the same as individual level unemployment. Yes. But when you try to measure some unobserved construct, not unemployment, we can see whether some guy has a job or has not a job. The same at the aggregate level. You can just count all guys who have no jobs, and to say that 20% of the population of this land are unemployed. But in factor analysis, you measure some unobserved. And here my second important comment. The distinction between reflective logic of measurement and combinatorial logic of measurement is also fair. You can use one approach, you can use another approach. But you should always keep in mind the key difference between two methods. Reflective logic measures some constructs that really exist in people's heads. But when you use formative logic, you measure something normative. So you set a standard which actually do not exist in the reality because it cannot be proven by some actual correlation structures, because strong correlations, strong coherence of the construct means that people really combine this construct, these items in the construct, in their heads. And your third argument, third point, is about the growing, increasing coherence in emancipated layers, increasing with, yes. just a second. Coherence agrees both with means and with cognitive mobilization. But what does mean? When the means in emancipative values are low, there are no emancipative values. There are no strong coherence patterns. But this coherence exists occur when we go further, and it means that emancipative values really exist in highly developed countries, but do not exist as some coherent pattern in low modernized countries. So if you use formative logic, I think it's not necessary to refer to increasing coherence because it contradicts your basic concepts of formative logic. So you yourself in your paper judge the formative construct by referring to its increasing coherence. It's not necessary to do that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Boris. Chris, one at a time or more?
No, I take this one by itself. With the third point I give you, I totally agree with you. You're right. With a formative concept, you measure, you set a normative standard that is theoretically predefined. Therefore, with formative concepts, you always start from theory, not from evidence. So you set a normative standard, but it doesn't mean it's not real. You measure the reality against that standard. That the fact that this might not converge at the individual level simply tells you that not in all people's head these things are going consistently together. Might be with some people, not with others. It might combine in different ways. It only tells you it doesn't happen with everyone. That's all that tells you, but it can happen with some people. And simply you do these combinatory constructs because you think that the combination has certain consequences that are demonstrable. And I think my reality, my take on reality is that if something is real in its consequences, it is real in itself.
But the key point is what is a consequence of words. The argument referred to increasing coherence means that emancipative values are the consequence of some other process.
We cannot turn it into a dialogue and have to give other people a chance.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm also sorry. This is fascinating.
I'd like to offer a couple of my reflections on this talk. I noticed that there are two authors of this presentation, and I do it reluctantly because I cannot claim I have understood all these ideas. For instance, non-overlapping variants, complementary reality coverage. These are examples of concepts which are still elusive to me. It is also not clear to me what sort of claims have been made in the literature and then rebuked by you concerning this situation with unemployment and vote for the Nazis. Because I think of it like this. These are two dichotomous variables. If we have a number of observations for every region, then we deal with a contingency table. And we can use alterations to express association or express dependency. And what happens if we look at a number of regions is very well understood by epidemiologists in terms of confounding and when Simpson's paradox works and so on and so forth. But here the assumption is that we deal with categorical variables. So I was not certain how I should understood references to correlation, because this can be understood as correlation sensu stricto, linear correlation, or perhaps correlation as a concept. So that in the case of categorical variables, we would rather speak about association and use very different measures than Pearson correlation coefficient. And the last part of my reflections is this. I wonder whether it would be acceptable to the author as a matter of courtesy to make available some of his prominent data sets for reanalysis. I have put forward some ideas which seem to be consistent with your overall principles, namely we should not overemphasize what happens at the individual level, but look at what happens in the sample and so on and so forth. And I would be very keen to use exactly the same data set and then look at the results and see whether there are any differences concerning what the data tell us.
Okay.
Well, that's easy. This is based on the World Value Survey, and those are publicly available, so you can go to the webpage and download this data, and the indices of emancipative values are also in the World Value Survey included, and they are also available in aggregate form, and also in their subcomponents, and also the effective democracy index is available from the Quality of Government Institute.
I'm aware
web.
of this, of course, but I would like to start exactly with the same data set that
That's the same
to
data.
avoid, you know,
I can navigate you through that.
Yeah, it's publicly available.
Yeah, it's available. It's no. I mean, he worked with these data as well because they were available.
I have a small question. As a user of the emancipated, as a consumer, would it mean that it should be banned to use emancipated values on the individual level whatsoever?
No,
Why?
no, because can you go one more back? And one more? And one more? The next bar chart I need. Yep. This is individual level correlations here, because actually at the individual level, that importance of this concept is even more obvious because it sticks out even more clearly in the correlation strength from its components than it does at the aggregate level. So it does make sense to use this. Of course, I'm also providing the sub-indices in order to enable researchers to whatever their research question is. You might be particularly interested in a particular sub-index like gender equality index or sexual freedom index or people's voice index, and then you can look at them specifically, and so that's up to the researcher. Yeah, so I've tried to leave people that, so I'm not propagating. You have always to use the long version of that index. You can also use the shorter version indices depending on what your research question is.
Okay. Peter, you might be the last one.
Luck.
Look.
Concerning formative versus reflective indicators, I mean, you have given some clear arguments, but from a, let's say, from a point of view of truth, so to speak, it's still not clear, because from a methodological point of view, you can say, okay, I have good correlations, but when one would run a second order factor analysis and then use some dependent variables because of the correction of measurement error, maybe the second order factor also, like the long version or like some formative index, would have a high correlation. So it is really difficult to decide empirically. That's also discussed in the literature on formative and reflective. In principle, one would have to use either panel data or experiments to check this out, so to speak. I mean, it's plausible what you say, but it's not a proof, I think.
That's, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah?
I would definitely agree with that. The, what I also did, I didn't want to make it too complicated. I also recreated the index of emancipative values in a reflective way. So by giving the components factor weights in how I bring them together. And that means choice gets the highest weight, equality the second highest, voice the third highest, and autonomy is always the lowest because that's the weakest factor loading. And what that means, what you're doing, so autonomy has the smallest amount of overlapping variance with the latent construct, if it should exist, and therefore it's way down. And then I correlate the reflective version with these. So I would say education and informational connectedness are theoretically expected antecedents of the values, whereas output trust, movement activity, and are dependent. So they're looking at both sides of the equation with the linkages, right?
So
You would find that the reflective version usually is a little weaker in its linkage pattern than the formative version. Not always, but usually.
But this is very interesting, so glad you didn't show it. Thank you. Well, our time is up. Chris, this is very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.